Welcome to the panel on innovations and accountability for law enforcement. My name is Carter Stewart. I'm a managing director with the Draper Kaplan Foundation. We fund startup nonprofits around the world. And I come from the background of working at the Department of Justice, where I was a federal prosecutor for 10 years, and where I saw over time that the majority of people I felt that I prosecuted came from broken systems. Broken education, broken mental health, whatever the case may be, which spurred me when I left the Department of Justice to want to go to a place where I felt I could help build or replace those systems, and that's what I think the foundation where I am right now is doing. And very happy to be able to support this conference, and thank you again to all of you for being here, for caring about this issue, and we hope this will be a very productive, useful panel that you will be able to then act upon when you go back to your regular lives. We are very fortunate to have an incredible panel here, and I'm not going to go into depth in their bios because you have them, but I will start with Lori Lightfoot, who is immediately to my right. She is a litigation partner at the Mayer Brown law firm, but she's also president of the Chicago Police Board. To her right is John HOLLWAY, who is an associate dean at the University of Pennsylvania Law School and also the executive director for the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice. And to his right is SERPAS, who is now a professor at Loyola University focusing on criminology, but prior to that he was a police officer and a police chief both in Nashville and New Orleans. And to his right is CRISTINE DEBERRY, who is now chief of staff at the district attorney's office in San Francisco, where they are a cutting-edge office, frankly, among DAs for bringing about change. So the issue that we are focusing on today is accountability. The reason I think it's relevant is because my experience as a prosecutor, there was actually, let me close the door. There was always the tension between law enforcement and the communities that law enforcement were protecting on accountability. The police officers that I talked to said, we need folks in the community to come forward and tell us who shot whom. We need witnesses. And they were frustrated because the community was not, in their eyes, forthcoming in terms of saying who did things, and the police officers felt that they were prohibited or inhibited from holding people accountable in the community. On the flip side, community members felt that when police officers did wrong, when there were shootings, when there was police brutality, they felt that the police officers weren't held accountable. And there was this ongoing frustration between the two groups, which had a negative impact on community trust, which also had a negative impact on our ability in the prosecutor's office to pursue cases and to keep the community safe. So this is an active tension, and the four folks on this panel are representative of organizations that actually hold police accountable and hold law enforcement accountable, but from very different perspectives. So I would like, the plan for today is they're each going to present what they do and how they do it from their perspectives. I'll ask a few questions to have a discussion among the group, and then we'll throw it open to questions from you all. And again, thank you all for being here, and Lori, we'll start with you, if you wouldn't mind taking the mic, and we'll go down.
Okay. Can everybody hear me in the back of the room? All right. Let me begin by kind of giving you context for the work that I've been involved in particular over the last 2 years in Chicago. Many of you may be aware that in late November of 2015, there was a videotape that was released that showed a young black man, really 19-year-old kid, being killed by a white Chicago police officer. That young man was Laquan McDonald. The police officer subsequently been charged with murder, and his case is pending. My explanation doesn't even begin to do justice of what that meant in Chicago. For decades, there have been issues and problems in the relationship between the police and particularly communities of color in Chicago, and frankly that's an issue that's played out in cities large and small, really all over the country. But for us, the release of that video was really, I think, the tipping point for this outrage and rage and frustration that had been pent up for a very long time and then erupted into full display. One of the things that happened as a result of that is the mayor of our city convened what was subsequently called the Police Accountability Task Force, which I chaired. Soon after the task force was announced, DOJ announced that it was coming in to do a pattern and practice investigation. And the level of kind of civic involvement and engagement around issues of policing probably has never been at a higher time. What also was happening and continues to plague our city is that violence erupted in a way that we hadn't seen in Chicago really going back to the mid-1990s. We were kind of hovering at around 300, 400 murders a year. In 2016, we shot up to almost 800 murders. We're on a similar trajectory now in 2017, a little bit better, but not much better. There's lots of, obviously, dynamics going on. So as Carter indicated, aside from the work that I did on the Police Accountability Task Force, I am also the president of the Chicago Police Board. And what we do is essentially we're a court that grapples with serious issues of police misconduct, where the superintendent is seeking the either lengthy suspension or termination of officers. But I want to divert from that for a moment and talk a little bit about, I think, a challenge that certainly is on the table in Chicago, but I suspect probably is also a challenge in other jurisdictions across the country. And that is a question of legitimacy. And I mean that both in terms of the police legitimacy with the community, but also internal legitimacy within police departments. And a subtext of that is, can you be pro-police, pro-law enforcement, and also be pro-reform and pro-accountability? One of the things that has struck me over and over again, and particularly in these last 2 years that I've been involved in this conversation, is that the narrative that has been put out there, which is that if you can't be pro-police if you are pro-reform and pro-accountability, is a dangerous narrative for a number of reasons. Not the least of which is the notion that officers and, frankly, supervisors and senior members of the department believe that if you haven't been the police, that you have no right to assess them, criticize them, perform oversight over them, is a very real problem. And it's a problem that we absolutely must grapple with if we're ever going to really be able to go back and restore legitimacy in the eye of the police in the eyes of the public. I'll give you one example. I was recently in a training session with the Chicago Police Department and with very senior members of the department. And the conversation, it was a training around, the department has rolled out a new use of force policy. But the conversation and the undercurrent, even with members of the police board in the room, was, who are you? Why do you think you have any legitimacy to talk to us, to criticize us? And we should be able to do our job without any encumbrance. And everything was fine until that video got released. Now, there's many, many problems with that. But what it shows is that if that's, 2 years in, kind of the level of discourse of senior members of the department, what's the temperature and the temperament of people down at the grassroots level, people that are officers on the beat? And I believe that that's still a significant problem. We have got to figure out a way to create a space where we I think, get back to core principles of policing, which is you serve and protect the community. The community cedes certain rights and responsibilities to the police departments in order to allow them to effectively police us and to protect us. But what we haven't ceded is our constitutional rights. What we haven't ceded is our ability to question and challenge policing strategies and tactics that aren't working. Just to give you another framing reference for Chicago, we have at any given time in our federal courts 400 to 500 different civil lawsuits pending against police officers and the city of Chicago. My judge friends tell me that that dwarfs every other jurisdiction in the country by several hundred cases. Last year alone in Chicago, we spent over $50 million, $50 million just in settlements and judgments and attorney's fees around police misconduct. And over the last several years, I think it's almost been $500 million. These are dollars that are not accounted for in the city budget, that we have to go into the bond market and pay for at crazy interest rates because of the fiscal issues in Chicago. So we are in a crisis that demands and requires, I think, a kind of leadership and rethinking the notion of accountability and legitimacy that unfortunately we're taking baby steps toward when we need to be sprinting towards a destination. And it's a real problem and issue. And my final point, and then I'll cede the microphone. What is the solution here? What we see in our city, and I've seen it across the country, is this anger and rage that too many folks on the opposite sides of an issue have. And frankly, it's clearly playing out as part of the national political dialogue as well. But for me, anger and rage, while we have to recognize and respect the lived experiences of people and communities, particularly around policing, those two emotions don't drive us towards solutions. And so we have to think about that issue. We have to think about moving forward with real definitive actions and leadership towards forming solutions to solve this issue of accountability and legitimacy. And for me, one of the most important steps is helping educate citizens about the facts. Police departments, unfortunately, historically have been less than transparent, and that's probably a supreme understatement. And the problem there is when you're not transparent, it's not like people are just ignorant. The void gets filled, and unfortunately it gets filled with a lot of urban myth, a lot of misperceptions, which perpetuates the lack of trust. So putting out more information, providing real concrete data about police activity, but also from a kind of fundamental citizenship standpoint, educating people so that they can find their voice, so they can advocate for themselves, and they can, frankly, bridge the divide between themselves and police departments, to me is critically important. It seems to be something that folks, step past because there's this assumption of education and baseline knowledge about the ABCs of policing in a city. That's not true based on my experience. And for me, where it's got to start is really just coming together, educating people about the basics so that we have a basic set of knowledge that we can then have a discussion around. But without that, I think that what we end up doing is filling that void with more and more misinformation that only drives us further apart.
Thanks. So I'm John HOLLWAY. I work at Penn Law, and I run a center called the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice, which champions what we call a systems approach to preventing errors in criminal justice. The idea is that we look at other complex human systems that are high risk, high stress, dynamic environments where people are making life and death decisions with limited to imperfect data, and we try to figure out how those systems improve over time. Because if you want to think about what system accountability is, I think systems aren't accountable to be perfect, but they are accountable to try to improve. And criminal justice has a pretty crappy quality improvement record. We don't analyze our mistakes. Now, you could define the system lots of different ways. Policing is a system within the criminal justice system. And just as an aside, as I'm sure Christine would agree, if you think police aren't transparent, wait till you get to prosecutors and defense attorneys. So, opacity abounds. But what we have to do is we have to take, we take principles of quality improvement from healthcare and aviation, and we try to apply them to errors in criminal justice. So you could have lots of different definitions about what an error in criminal justice is. I would argue that any officer-involved shooting is an error, whether or not the police officer acted in a reasonable way and followed all of the protocols, you simply don't want to have a situation ever where a police officer has really even had to fire their weapon, much less done so and actually hit somebody. So I think it's possible that you can talk about error without talking about misconduct, and it's possible to talk about mistakes or unintended outcomes or adverse events without being pejorative or being accusatory. Emotionally in criminal justice, what we do is we administer blame all day, every day. So it's a fairly revolutionary concept for people's mindsets to have a conversation where we say, we all can agree something went wrong, but we're not trying to blame anybody, we're trying to learn from this event. But that's what we try to do, and we try to do that with root cause analysis, and other procedures that have actually helped, for example, aviation go from 400 crashes per 1,000 to less than 2 per million, and other things like that, because really the underlying principles are universal. It's just a question of where you apply them in the system. So you could say that policing is a system. You could say that a wrongful conviction is an error in the system. You could also even go a step larger than that, and I would argue that the purpose of the prosecutorial aspect of criminal justice is to get the right guy in the right way. In other words, we should be holding accountable people who committed crimes so long as we adjudicated those crimes in ways that preserve their constitutional freedoms, right? So as long as we get the right guy in the right way, mission accomplished. If we don't get the right guy, so cold case, that's an error. If we get the wrong guy, error. And if we get the right guy but we had no business searching his trunk, error. Because those protections are there to help us get the right guy in the first place. You could go a level up and talk about the purpose of the criminal justice system, because that would get the right guy in the right way doesn't really bring in corrections. And so for that, I would argue that the purpose of the criminal justice system has to be to put itself out of business. If the purpose of the criminal justice system isn't to reduce crime, then I don't know what we're doing here. And when you start thinking about it that way, you still have to get the right guy in the right way, but then when you have them, you have to do something useful to reducing crime. And to me, that creates a different approach to mass incarceration, because now what we're realizing is that put the guy in a box isn't necessarily useful in reducing crime either from that person or from other people who might imitate that person's actions. But I think that what we try to do is we try to tell the system that, A, the system has an obligation to be accountable, and when we do something wrong, what a responsible system does is it addresses that and it tries to learn from that. And B, that when you take that approach and say, I'm not trying to see who gets fired, I'm just trying to see what we can learn from this to prevent it. If you look at a wrongful conviction or an officer-involved shooting, the way the National Transportation Safety Board looks at a plane crash or a train derailment, you ask very, very different questions, because you're no longer saying who's to blame, you're saying why did this happen? And to take a potentially inflammatory example, you know, in Ferguson, Missouri, I have a hard time believing that Michael Brown woke up that morning and said, this is great. Today's the day I get to get gunned down and bleed to death in the street. But I also have a hard time believing that Darrell Wilson woke up that morning and thought, this is great. Today I get to shoot an unarmed kid and lose my job. And if neither of those people woke up that morning with that being their desired outcome for the day, then we have to ask, what were the external circumstances that led to a situation where Michael Brown did what he did and Darrell Wilson did what he did? And when you start asking those questions, I think you start asking very different questions than the questions that we all as communities have asked about the Ferguson situation. Now, the questions that have been asked about Ferguson are legitimate and important, and the way we police and the issues of bias and all of those things, I don't want to minimize those. But root cause analysis and sentinel event reviews should be happening in parallel, and they are an important part of the accountability that we do in the system. The accountability to continue to improve our system is something that gets missed in the individual accountability of misconduct and blame that permeates our criminal justice conversation. So I'll pause there and turn it over to the Chief.
Actually, if I could just jump in real quick, Ron, before you go, I had two quick follow-up questions to that. In terms of that type of analysis, can you give an example of how researchers have done that analysis that led to a positive outcome, and how do you get police departments or prosecutors' offices or other folks involved in the criminal justice system to engage in the type of analysis you just described? And then we'll go to your round.
So we did one in Philadelphia. We looked at the largest mass murder in Philadelphia history. It was 4 guys stormed a crack house at the end of the year, near New Year's in 2001. The 4 guys took the 10 people that were there, lined them all face down, and just started firing. 7 of the people died, 3 survived. About 6 weeks later, an 18-year-old male in Philadelphia confessed to the crime and named 3 accomplices, and those 4 guys were incarcerated for 22 months until the eve of trial, when the case entirely blew up and it was obvious to everybody that they had the wrong 4 guys, and forensic and ballistic evidence led them to 4 other guys. And so there are people who say to that, all right, the system worked. That's not my personal view. My personal view is, okay, we got the right guys at the end, but you still don't want those 4 guys in jail for 22 months. And it was the most public, most publicized, most closely covered, most closely investigated, can't make a mistake on this case that you could ever have. And still, we got it wrong. So we sat down with the DA's office, the police department, the Defender Association, the Court of Common Pleas, and some representatives from the city of Philadelphia, and we ran through this process. And at the end of it, and this is exactly what you see in aviation or healthcare, et cetera. If somebody has their right leg operated on, it was supposed to be the left leg. When you actually go back and do the whole thing, what you see is there are mistakes throughout the process that people have made, and any one of the mistakes could have been caught and would have stopped the problem. And it's only when they all come together that, like, the Challenger blows up or the wrong limb gets operated on. And so, not surprisingly, we found recommendations for each agency that was involved to adopt. And this was a collaborative process, and they each volunteered things that they might change that would prevent the error from happening again. We generated a report that listed those. And the group liked that process enough that they re-upped, and we got some funding from the National Institute of Justice to keep that group, now called the Philadelphia Event Review Team, going on a cyclical basis for 3 years. So how do you get them involved? It's got to be voluntary, and that can be a challenge. And it can be a challenge because people have a hard time believing that we're going to do what we say we're going to do, and we've evolved some processes to try and penetrate the skepticism. Some places were more successful than others. But the output then is hopefully a series of implementable changes that would have prevented this so that the next guy in that same situation doesn't have the same unintended outcome. And because those groups have created it themselves, you get 2 benefits. One is the groups learning how to talk to one another, and the other is customizably implementable reforms that will work in your jurisdiction, and because you were part of the process, they're not viewed as threats.
So you ruined my day. I'm going on a plane in about 4 hours, and I'm going to a surgeon tomorrow morning.
Years. You're all fine.
Yeah. So good afternoon. Obviously the way I approached this is I was a change agent chief 3 times. Governor Locke hired me to be the chief of the state police in Washington State, not because he wanted the status quo, but he wanted change. Mayor Purcell hired me to be the chief in Nashville, not because he wanted the status quo, he wanted change. And Mayor Landrieu hired me to be the chief in New Orleans, again, not because he wanted the status quo, he wanted change. And what's happened in these last many years is a lot of finger-pointing on the question of accountability inside policing, right? We'll talk about the community separately. But inside policing, what we've, I think, have forced ourselves to come to the understanding is that in each of those 3 departments, as a person brought in from the outside to affect change, particularly around the issues of service and accountability, strange as it might seem to you, in each one of those departments, it's about 3 to 5% of the officers are going to be the officers you see constantly coming up with the complaints of discourtesy, coming up with all these different errors. So then you get into this debate. What is the relevancy of the labor organization? What is the relevancy of the first-line supervisors? And now the new part of this debate is what is the relevancy of the employees who are choosing not to become police officers? So the walk away for me after 34 years in policing and now being retired 3, policing now has to change for so many reasons we've been discussing, but if they don't change in the way they hold one another accountable, the younger officers are simply going to not join. Because it's always been my experience that the younger officers usually are better educated, they're obviously more diverse, and they're more likely to accept personal accountability with each other. right? We always have stories of a thin blue line, and we have stories of police officers observing misconduct and not acting. But I have dozens of other stories where police officers came in and said, Sarge, I'm not working with that guy no more. I'm not working with that officer anymore. Here's a video I saw that shows the problem we have. So I don't think that we missed the opportunity to recognize today is the time that police leaders have to change all of their systems of accountability. And they have to change them because the new employees are not going to accept the way it always was. They're just not going to believe it. We implemented, if you lie, you're terminated in Nashville. We implemented, if you lie, you're terminated in New Orleans. There was no mass exodus. There wasn't people running to quit the police department. In fact, it turned out to be the biggest ho-hum because a lot of those officers intuitively understood, well, that means they reward me for telling the truth, that telling the truth matters. That's a small but subtle change. And to be honest with you, there's other police professionals in the room, but I think we've missed the opportunity to see the new metrics. Nancy and the Urban Institute put out a report earlier this year that literally knocked my socks off after 34 years of policing. We have lived with the perception from the data that we capture that 3 to 5% of any arrest results in the use of force. But when they interviewed 10,000 police officers across the country, and they were asked if you have used force in the last 30 days, it was nearly 33% had said they had used some force in the last 30 days. We have to think, what does that mean, right? How does that actually make such a huge difference that we don't know that? How do we not know that? Another piece to accountability, and I'm sure this won't be popular with my friends in law enforcement, is we promote sergeants and then they reward each other by being in the same labor organization, and they reward each other by being people's friends. What's more important to them is who invites them to coffee. What's more important to them is who talks nice about them after roll call. And in fact, those people are the ones that we're having the most difficult time changing the metric, changing the measure, changing the level of accountability. Because, you know, having been the chief of 2,000 person operations, I'm not putting my hands on every single person all day long every day. And you have this huge organization behind you that you're counting. And it speaks a little bit to what Lori sees on the police board. Because you have these dramatic cases of disciplinary action. The chief gets on television and says, this is horrible, this person's got to be released, I'm releasing them effective tomorrow, and about a year later they end up coming back on the job. Court overturns it. Police should not roll into the corner and say, oh, the courts don't support us. In fact, more often than not, it was the investigation that fell apart. In fact, more often than not, it was the sergeants and lieutenants failing to take accountable their responsibility to ferret out misconduct and make corrective actions on the spot. So putting aside all the pressures on the outside of organizations that we can talk about, inside the organizations, we have to do a better job of selecting leaders. We have to do a better job of holding the leaders accountable. And we have to do a better job, and I wish John hadn't said it. You're right. We need to investigate the use of force and injuries in the workplace as if it is a plane that had fallen out of the sky. Because candidly, 2 officers died while in service with me. And we had to bury 2 officers who died in service. How many officers are injured, but we're afraid because of the culture, we're afraid of being seen as not supportive and caring to the families, we're afraid of being seen as, you know, Monday morning quarterbacking, because even, believe it or not, even after being a chief all my life, police officers don't think I have a right to judge them either. And that's where we need to go, because then the answers start to become so much more clear. And it's much easier to move forward. So basically, inside the culture, we've got to deal with what really matters. We've got to appoint the right kinds of people. We've got to quit arguing about whether or not we did a good disciplinary investigation. We need to do a good one. If we're going to hold people accountable, we need to follow the rules and make sure it's right, so you don't have the stories we've been seeing in the Washington Post and the New York Times around the country of officers who are being reinstated to service who everybody in the global universe knows shouldn't be there. But some error inside the culture allowed them to get replaced, put back on. And it's really, a lot of this is inside. We can talk about outside later, how the community holds us accountable.
Ron, if I could ask you one follow-up question too. Based on that last example, you said that there can be errors that lead to somebody who is fired being rehired. The public perception from the folks I've talked to is that there are union rules and other rules that no matter how good the investigation is, will result in an officer who committed actions that didn't necessarily rise to criminal, but still were pretty bad in terms of roughing somebody up or shooting someone, and then they're protected, and there's absolutely nothing the police department can do about it. Is that a realistic perception?
I've worked in very strong union state. Washington State is an incredibly strong union state. Tennessee is a right-to-work state. Louisiana is a right-to-work state. More often than not always, more often than not, there was a fundamental flaw in the way the administrative investigation was done. And my daughter's a lawyer, right? She's trained to find those flaws, and that's what happens. The other problem with that, and just to be candid, if you're a brand new city attorney in Chicago or New Orleans or Nashville, you usually get assigned to the police misconduct work. You don't generally have as much experience as the opposing counsel, who is hired specifically and has worked for years with the labor organization, knows the nuances, knows the in and outs of the law, knows exactly how to get around hurdles and obstacles that the younger attorney doesn't know. And when we get to the community piece, I'll just leave y'all with this hint. In thousands of community meetings I've led, literally thousands, we trained you to say, I don't want lettuce on my burger, and I want lettuce on your burger, and I'll tell y'all what that means later.
Okay, Lori, I wanted to ask.
Yes, you're stuck with that.
I just wanted to jump in on that last question. Again, I think it's all about transparency and accountability as to whether or not disciplinary actions against police officers are actually going to stick. When I came on the Chicago Police Board in the summer of 2015, the police board agreed with the superintendent's recommendations for termination only 35% of the time. Now, it's not like there's I hasten to add, there's not a quota, right? But what I started looking at is, well, why is that? That seems like a pretty significant disconnect. And Ronald hit one of them on the head. That we had very inexperienced lawyers representing the superintendent in front of the police board, and we have, you know, the Perry Masons of our city representing these police officers. So they were absolutely running circles around these inexperienced kids. So that was something that I put some focus on, and we changed that. You know this, trial lawyer 101, you don't try a case by yourself. We were sending young, inexperienced lawyers to try these cases by themselves against these very experienced officers. Another thing is also, we would get to the right result, but then the police officer would appeal and it would go to the circuit court. So one of the things that is still on my to-do list is talking to the circuit court. They say, well, you know, don't fire this officer. Give him a 5-year suspension. Well, what sense does that make, right? 5 years, he's got to go back, he's got to retread. Maybe the hope is that within 5 years' time he'll find something else to do, but an amazing number of people would, buy their time for 5 years and they would come back on the job. And that, I think, again, undermined the credibility of our disciplinary system. There's ways in which that can be turned around. In the 2 years that I've been focused on our process, we're probably at about 95% agreement. And it's not that we are rubber stamping what the superintendent does, quite the contrary, but we've made sure that the various inputs to our process by the time we get a case are strengthened as much as possible, making sure that the investigations are done right, making sure that they're done thoroughly and that they're timely. And then when the evidence is presented, for example, they were presenting cases in front of us where a case had started 5 years before, they wouldn't even go back and interview the witnesses ahead of time before they made a charging decision. Well, that's ludicrous, of course. So you literally have witnesses, like my first case, woman was the key witness in a termination case. She had all sorts of mental health problems in the intervening time period, and she took the stand after she said her name. She said, "I'm high as a kite, and I have no idea what I said before or what happened." Well, no one had talked to her. I mean, very basic stuff. And so we turned that around, and now we're getting the actual serious cases that are being well done, and we have very vigorous debates amongst ourselves, but I think we're reaching the right and best conclusions because the evidence that we have in front of us is much better, much stronger, because the inputs to our system have understood their role and why it's important for them to be doing their job at the highest capacity.
Hi, everybody. CRISTINE DEBERRY. I'm in the San Francisco District Attorney's Office. I'm going to talk about this from a little bit different perspective. About 2 years ago in San Francisco, we discovered that 14 police officers were sending maybe the most inflammatory racist messages amongst themselves you can imagine. Not casual use of the N-word, but hanging people from trees and burning crosses on school lawns in San Francisco. And it sent a big shockwave through my office and our city as we tried to understand what was happening, how widespread this issue was, and why it was not brought to light other than reading it in the newspaper by our police department. And it caused DA Gascon, our DA, to really ask some hard questions of our chief and of our own office about what we were going to do in response to these officers' deeply held beliefs that were just coming to light. And it resulted in us pulling every single case that those officers had ever been involved with. It was over 4,000 arrests that they had made. And the DA said, you need to go through every single one of them. And you need to look at what happened there and try to understand whether we want to stand by the work that we did in those cases that we filed, and whether something else needs to happen for those people. But that was just the beginning of the amusement park ride we are still on in San Francisco, and I think in a lot of cities around the country. Under the leadership we had in our department at that time, we then entered a phase of really problematic, fatal officer-involved shootings that raised even more questions for us, not involving those 14 officers, but with different officers. And we found ourselves in the situation of not having the federal government's support because they were engaged in other consent decrees and work around the country, of trying to figure out, with our local resources and our local concern, how do we now solve this problem for ourselves? And if you have been engaged in that work, you will know what I'm saying is there is nothing in place for you to do that. Even in a city like San Francisco that has a police commission that's occupied by civilians, and we have an Office of Citizen Complaints, still none of those systems were catching these bigger systemic problems. And so the DA essentially tasked me with trying to figure out how do we now dig into this problem, figure out what the interaction between our office and the police department is, improve that communication and the transparency to us so that we can make sure we're not passing along some of the ugly beliefs and actions that we were seeing. And I think it's become even clearer now with the current federal administration and the position they have taken on this, that you will be your own civil rights division, right? There is nowhere else you can go and ask for help. So I would urge everybody that's in local government or interacting with local government to think about what those mechanisms are you need in your community to deal with both excessive use of force and other disciplinary problems within your police department. What we did in San Francisco, once we kind of came to the conclusion, we formed a blue ribbon panel. We asked 3 retired judges and 14 white shoe law firms to come in and look at everything. And it was very informative. Mostly we learned how obstructive our police union was, unfortunately. They spent the entire time bad-mouthing the review, calling it a kangaroo court, refusing to provide any documents, in a way that I think was so harmful to the department and their reputation, and I thought was a real travesty for the men and women in that department, because they really could not get out from under this horrible, horrible PR that the union was running around these issues. But what we learned at the end of that was that we needed to also take a bigger role in overseeing our police department and be more active in that. And that was not really well received, to be quite honest. If you're going to do this work, spine of steel. But we thought it was imperative that we had a better understanding of what was happening in the police misconduct cases, and that we could bring our own independence to that. So we went to the mayor's office and asked for funding to create our own investigations unit so that we could separately investigate the police department in excessive use of force cases. That was vehemently opposed, but ultimately funded after we threatened going to the voters, who I think were very supportive. The mayor and the board of supervisors saw that that was probably a better answer and funded us, and we've now been funded. We created what's called an Independent Investigations Bureau. It reports directly to the district attorney, so there's no other managers in between that. It has 6 attorneys, 6 investigators, and 2 paralegals. And they now go to the scene of every officer-involved shooting or in custody death and conduct an entirely independent criminal investigation. We're still dependent on portions of the police department for crime scene control and evidence collection, but we are able to be there in the moment with adequate staff to ask the important questions, because what we were seeing on these cases is the cake is already baked by the time you get the paper file, right? So all the witnesses have been interviewed, the police officer has been interviewed by another police officer, and everything is all in order. And it makes it very hard for the attorneys in the room to then talk to a witness and you get a different statement. Well, now you just have competing statements and you have a weakened witness and you have credibility issues. And so the concerns we had really went to the investigative stages of this work in addition to our charging decisions. We didn't feel we would ever get to a good charging decision if we didn't have confidence in the investigative process and that was clean and thorough. So we've been able to now advocate for those resources, and we're in the process. Unfortunately, it's taken more than a year to negotiate a memorandum of understanding with the police department that gives us that lead authority. But I think what I've learned through this process is, one, don't wait for somebody else to do it, because there aren't that many people that want to dive into the difficulty of these issues from any angle, community, within government. It's tough. And so if you have a sense of the injustice around it, get involved. Resources are critically important to any of this work. And one of the things I think is missing in justice reinvestment conversations is talking about reinvesting some of the dollars we're moving away from incarceration and supervision and into these kind of accountability system reforms, because those are easier sells, I think, on justice reinvestment than saying you need to now slash 50 employees. But maybe we need to reposition those to make sure that the system is working well as it continues to move along. Those are resources most offices don't have, and they're hard to get in local government, and there's something that we should really be thinking about. And then I would say that if your interest is in officer-involved shootings and fatalities, yes, look at your decision maker, look at your police chief to see if they are disciplining people and separating from them when they're problematic. Yes, look at your prosecutor and make sure he or she is taking a critical, hard look at those cases. And then dig in on changing the law, because the law is exceptionally permissive around when police officers can use force in the line of duty, and almost no factual scenario stacks up. So you see shootings all the time, and decision makers will tell you it is terrible, but it is not illegal. And oftentimes they're giving you an accurate assessment of how the facts and the law come together. And if we want to be policed differently, then we need different laws to guide that process. And we need to think about whether reasonable force is what we want, or whether we want an officer to only use necessary force. And we want them to be more sparing in that use of force, then we need laws that tell them to do so, because right now we are not. Some departments do train them to these better standards, but the law does not hold them to those. And so I would ask you to really think about, nationally and on a state level, do your laws match up to what you think your principles are in a democracy about how you want to be policed?
So a couple of follow-up questions for you, Christine. First of all, what happened with those 14 officers and the cases that you reviewed?
So the 14 officers are still there. We are all paying their salaries. The police department did not reveal their identities to us for 2 years, nor did they commence an internal investigation of them, and there's a statute of limitations on the discipline in California, so after 1 year, there was no ability to take any action against them.
Wow.
So
Okay.
the people that said all mixed breed children should be hung from trees, now Latino and African American citizens are paying their pensions and their salaries.
And how would you describe your office's relationship with the police? Because you now have formed a special unit to investigate them. They also are the same department that are tasked with bringing you cases, and you depend on them to function as an office. So how does that dynamic work?
Yeah, that's a work in progress, I would say. We had a very tense relationship with our prior chief. We really did. We hit a place where we could not get to any agreement around the problems that we were seeing in the department and a path forward with him. And he was very dug in around the Blue Ribbon panel and why we needed it, and really uncooperative. Eventually, after the third fatal shooting, the mayor was under so much community pressure that he did ask him to step down. And then we have a new chief now, and he's just getting started. He's in his first year, but much more open to working with us and talking about reform, has already made great improvements on discipline. So I expect that that is improving. But one of the things that we put in place, and the reason we wanted a separate unit, is that these prosecutors only handle police misconduct cases and conviction review. So they are not then dependent on that same officer to come in on Saturday and help him walk through the robbery case that he has. She's not required to then say, please, I need to move my preliminary hearing up. Can you come in early? All of the things that are part of a good working relationship, normal working relationship between a DA and a police department, get very complicated in the police misconduct space. And in fact, most people in our office it was not as if everybody wanted to be in this unit, right? It was very, we did open it up to both internal and external. We did not have a lot of internal interest, and I'm in a progressive office, a very progressive office with great people. But prosecutors come to the work wanting to link arms with the police department and advance public safety, and that is a challenging task to then ask them to be the skeptics and the investigators of those partners. And so there's a clear line. They're in a separate building. They report directly to the DA. They don't handle any other criminal cases. When we complete a case, we turn it over to the Department of Justice, well, we're not turning it over to the federal government right now because we're just not. But frankly, around concerns around immigration, we just haven't felt like we should be giving the names of witnesses to these shootings to them. But we do turn it over to the California Attorney General so that he or she can review it and evaluate the decisions that we made and the evidence that we evaluated and see if they agree with our decision. We publish every report and do press statements so that anybody in the community that wants to know, they don't have to worry about it being done under cover of night. So those are some of the measures we've put in place to improve the independence. Obviously, people have concern about local prosecutors making decisions about local police. I think that's an important conversation, structural conversation we need to have. The problem with having your attorney general do it is they cannot go to the crime scene, right? In California, we have 58 counties, or as big as a country. You cannot go at 3 in the morning to the corner of Main Street and First and figure out who the shooter was and where the witnesses are. Maybe there was a woman up in that apartment that saw it. And that is so much of the critical part of what happens that we didn't want to lose that ability.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to questions in the audience for just in just a couple minutes. But CRISTINE touched on this at the end of her comments. You have a room full, and I'm talking to the panel, a room full of folks who care about this issue, who are advocates, policymakers, citizens. What advice would you give them to go back to their lives such that they can do as the best job possible holding law enforcement accountable for their actions?
So just recently, a major city in the nation announced that it was reducing any education requirement to be hired. A few months before that, another major... As a police officer, all right. I'm sorry, I should have said that. So just a few months ago, a very large police department in the country announced that it was no longer requiring any formal education to be hired as a prerequisite. About 2 months before that, another major police department in the country, after having been monitored by a federal team, acknowledged that 39 of the 150 candidates it had hired had not cleared background investigation files such that they should have been hired. Not only did they not release those people under probationary period, they said, well, we got to give people a chance. The argument here is this. All the way back to the Wickersham Commission in the 1930s, we've recognized that the community is always watching the police. And the police sometimes don't listen, but they're always watching. Even back in the 1930s, we knew that a diversified workplace with education would produce a better police service. Here we are in 2017, and we still have major police departments in this country that do not require any formal education. So when you start talking to those employees about traumatic informed response, when you start talking to those employees about brain injuries, and you start talking to those employees about guardian versus warriors, they've never had the benefit of learning how to think before they get to you. We had a very large police department in the country recently announced that there would not be a requirement for a bachelor's degree for the police chief. I know. And it got reverted, right? But think of what message does that send when we're taking the most complex piece of social engineering at 2 o'clock in the morning with a 23 or a 24-year-old person who has never been required to sit in someone else's environment and learn something from someone else before they make a choice. And we keep perpetuating that. Big cities throughout this country perpetuate it. That is really one of the biggest keys, is a better educated workforce can be changed, can mold itself, and can advance.
I think one of the most important takeaways for me is to really move the needle on these issues about accountability. You've got to build a culture of accountability within the police department itself. I mean, many of us are civilians. We believe very strongly in what we believe, but us kind of lobbing, bombs over the wall of a police department is just ultimately not going to work. We have to hold them accountable, and I think that that's absolutely a legitimate role for us to play. But ultimately, it's going to be much more effective and much longer lasting if we are smart about building that culture of accountability within the police department itself. That starts from recognizing, frankly, the conditions on the ground, from where you recruit. It starts with, frankly, thinking about the kind of police officers that we want to have. It is absolutely critical, and also thinking, and Ronald raised this point that I don't want to get lost, about supervision, making sure that we are, we've got a job description that actually matches what we want supervisors to do, and then designing test and screening measures to make sure that we're getting people who can actually do that job. These are very basic things. They're not innovative by any stretch of the imagination, but I am amazed at the number of police departments, and particularly large ones, and I'll talk about my own, that don't think about those kinds of things. So, we can impose our will from the outside, but it won't work if we don't think smartly about the way, who we're recruiting, why we're hiring them, how we're promoting, because we cannot bring that kind of sea change that I think many of us think is necessary and important without having buy-in internally within these police departments.
So a quick follow-up to that.
Sure.
In terms of how to impose the will, we have now throughout this country professional football players who are taking a knee to protest police misconduct, which is having mixed reactions, and depending on who you are and where you live. That's an attempt to try to control, to impose or push the police in a certain direction. For folks who are not football players, who are common citizens, have you seen strategies that have been taken on the outside to influence culture on the inside in Chicago?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a range of things that are going on, right? From the folks on the way left, I'll say, who think that we should be defunding the police department. As crazy as that is to me personally, there's a role that they are playing that I think is actually helpful. But the most important thing is linking arms and recognizing that there's a common sense of purpose between civilians and police officers, and trying to figure out lots of different ways, literally from just going up to an officer and engaging in a conversation and having them interact. For example, one of the things that we found through the work of our task force was when we talked to young people about their experiences with the police. When young people were in a school, they invariably had a much more positive interaction with officers in those schools than people who were on the outside and having interactions with police. And I think the reason is when you see someone as a human, and you see them every day, and you see them in the whole range of human emotions and vulnerability, both from the perspective of the police, but also from this perspective of the students and the young people, there's an opportunity to build a relationship. There's an opportunity to see someone as something other than the cardboard figure that they may present, or that your prejudice may imagine them being. So that is, to me, really important. But it's got to start with recognizing that there's actually legitimacy for police, that there's a value in supporting funding for high-quality training, making sure that we have educational standards that are right. But it's also got to be about, an issue that I'll throw out here. In our city where we have so many homicides, the homicide clearance rate is a real issue. When people feel like the police, we have a homicide clearance rate of 20%. Or if you actually live in Rosanna, well, correct me where I'm wrong, it's in single digits. That's unacceptable. And so we've got some pretty fundamental things that we got to get right first in order to actually have that conversation where we're trying to see each other as, as the same as us. But we've got a long way to go. But again, fundamentally, the change has got to come from within.
Yeah, so I guess to follow up quickly on one point that Chief made, a colleague of mine at Penn in the criminology department named Greg Ridgway did a study where he looked at shootings where there had been multiple police on the scene, and he compared the characteristics of the police who had drawn their weapons with the police in the same situation who hadn't drawn their weapons. And the largest causative factor that he found, and there were a variety, but the largest one was the age that the officer was when he or she joined the force. So the older that officer was when they joined the force, the less likely they were to draw their weapons in situations where it was close enough that not everybody drew their weapons. And obviously, the more education you have, the longer it's likely to be before you join the force. So I think those are mutually supportive data points. So just to bring that up. On a very concrete level, the Quattrone Center just got funding from the federal government to do 20 to 25 root cause analyses over the next 3 years in jurisdictions across the country. So if you see something, say something. We're here to help. And we'd love to work with your jurisdictions to walk you through this sort of thing. I bet you do. Yeah, and you've got, what, 4,000 cases? So that's probably more than we can do one by one, but maybe we'll, So we'd love to work with you to bring these principles of root cause analysis into your jurisdiction, because honestly, I think there's a lot of skepticism, but once people get into them and they understand how it works, we've seen a lot of enthusiasm.
I was just going to ask you, I was listening very intently when you were describing the work that you were doing. Is it fair to say there's something about policing, though, that's different than a train crash or an airplane crash? And I agree with you that there needs to be much more systematic, thoughtful, dispassionate after-action analysis so that we can learn from these very high-profile and sometimes deadly circumstances. But the game, right, where in these hardly charged circumstances can't be divorced from the circumstances on the ground and can't be divorced from the years of mistrust that's out there. So how do you do your work effectively in that context, which is different than a train crash or an airplane crash?
So the adversarial nature of the criminal justice system, I think, masks the fact that it actually has a common goal. And when I talk about the common goal being get the right guy in the right way or reduce crime, what I'm really trying to do is remind people that even though we have cop versus suspect or prosecutor versus defense attorney or community versus police or whatever, we're actually all trying to get to the same place, which is a safer community where we do what we say we're going to do, and we hold people who have committed crimes accountable, but we don't do so in ways that damages the fabric of the community. That's a basic principle of any human relationship. And the fact that we're in policing or aviation or whatever it is, everybody knows what's expected, right? Where it gets complex is in the details where people don't understand or aren't willing to share why they did certain things. So one of the things that we do is once we've established what happened in an event review, there's a concept that healthcare has brought out called a just culture. And the question is, how do you differentiate a good cop who had something happen that was reasonable in the moment but went someplace he didn't want it to go from a cop who was really out to game that system, or a prosecutor who was really out to game that system, or for that matter, a defense attorney who was out to game that system, because it happens at all places in the organization. And so you can actually, there's, hospitals have sort of tests, and management has developed tests for how you run through that process. And what you find when you do that is you're actually protecting your good officers. You're actually helping your organization create a way where the organization says, yeah, okay, John did something that you just don't do, whereas Bill did something that could have happened to any of us. And then you have to communicate that in a way that makes clear that that's what you're doing. And where the unions come in my personal opinion, is that they take away that ability. They take away that ability often to differentiate, because when you've still got those 14 cops on the force, the good cops know it's nonsense too, and it makes it harder for them to do their jobs because now the legitimacy is at issue. So I think you have to have processes that you're clear about and say, these are the procedures we're going to run. We're going to have an individual accountability conversation. We're going to have a civil liability conversation. And we're going to do what we need to do to prevent this from happening. And the accountability conversations don't change the system that allowed this to happen. They only weed out the bad apples. And in a world where, in any other industry that's looked at this, the bad apples are, 1/5 to sorry, not 1/5, like 20 or 30x to 1 errors to misconduct. So if you focus on errors, number one, you're going to take care of 20 errors for every 1 instance of misconduct. But number two, when you focus on errors, you reduce the loopholes in our system that allow misconduct to masquerade as error. So you have that effect on both those things, and you send a message to the police officers, which I know is important to both of you, that we're here to improve this. We're here to change your circumstances and make it harder for these mistakes to happen, so that then we don't have those misunderstandings about what's error and what's misconduct.
I know we have a couple of questions. We have to stop the panel with Ron explaining the burger with the lettuce and the non-lettuce.
So please take for granted that I'm telling you the absolute truth. I have been in thousands of community meetings as the police leader representing the police department in cities all throughout Washington State, Nashville, and New Orleans. And people generally just want a quality of life. And they're not that hung up on a lot of things that we hear a lot about. You go to these meetings, and in this community policing paradigm, which is much more complex than what I'm going to give it credit for, but basically when we say we're going to co-produce safety as a principle of community policing, that means that the police leadership is going to say to this neighborhood, do you like lettuce on your burgers or you don't? You don't like lettuce on your burgers, okay. And then the next day they'll be in this neighborhood and it'll be a completely different perception. That's not to suggest that we can't police across all these different cultures and all these different divides and all these different neighborhoods, but I haven't thought through this carefully enough yet. But after doing that for 15 years, you'd be surprised sometimes how dichotomous the differences are between what this neighborhood wants and what that neighborhood wants and what that neighborhood wants, and who is the community leader and who is not the community leader and who is the self-appointed leader. And by the time you figure all that out and you're a change agent, your mayor either got voted out of office or the union rallied up against you and you're gone. So fundamentally, we have, in a way with community policing, trained people to ask for what they want and expect to get it in a way that they should get it, and maybe we've lost some sight along the way of how to get there. Because those demands are unrelenting, and they're always going to be different. So maybe we need to rethink how we do that.
Okay. We'd like to open it up to the audience. Ma'am, if you wouldn't mind talking to the mic.
Hi, everyone. Hi, I'm Dara Baldwin. I do disability policy. So I want to say thank you for being here. Thank you for what you're saying. And I'm going to add to the list of demands. And also about what you're saying about education. So for us in our community, and I'm not a person with disability, but I've been an advocate for many years, so I'll say that. With us in policing, it's being a witness. It's being a victim. It's being a suspect. It's going through due process. And then also filing a complaint. None of these police departments are following the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And everyone, when they hear disability in policing, it is mental health. And let me tell you something, the data that we collect, because it's also not collected, the indicators are not there, we get this through, so I work for our national organization of the civil rights lawyers who are collecting this data from advocates. Deaf people and hard of hearing people are killed at a higher rate because they cannot hear you say, right? Stop, put your hands up. And this country refuses to take on what 60 other countries used, the light system, right? For the deaf community, right on a policeman's vest and do the light system. So they are trained and learn how to do that. So I say all of that to say, what is it we can do for our community so that the law enforcement is it's not just the law enforcement, it's also these community boards. You rarely see people with disabilities on them. They won't allow them to do it. Or they have them in meetings in places that are not accessible to them. Or they refuse to have an ASL interpreter. Or put things in large print. Or have someone there who can explain to people who have a lesser grade average, which is a social worker, to work with our community. How is it that we can infuse that? Because let me tell you something. The numbers are also wrong. It'll say 57 million people in this country have disabilities. It's much higher. It is much higher. And it is these children who are out here who have developmental disabilities and mental health, as well as deaf, blind, low vision, all of these things who are being left out of this conversation and who literally can't even tell you I'm a witness to a crime. Or they've been a victim of a crime. They are turned away from police departments. And when they want to file in San Francisco has a huge problem. There's not even a form in Braille. They won't put it in Braille across the country. So blind people can file a complaint with the police department. How do we fix that? How do we include people with disabilities in this whole entire process?
The one thing that has become perfectly clear to me all these years of being a chief, It's an analogy of a restaurant. Whenever you go to a good restaurant, you don't always think about what's going on in the back of the house. What are all the things that are going on behind your vision to get that dinner to you? What the Department of Justice during the Obama administration did incredibly well through consent decrees was actually, and I don't even know if this was their intent, I maybe should ask Carol or Vanita, but if you look at the departments that have trouble with disabilities, if you look at the departments that have trouble with so many things, there oftentimes is a trend that those back of the house projects, inspections divisions, training divisions, succession planning, promotional practice, they all got defunded over years and years and years of budgetary crisis. So the thing that's true about American policing is the sexiest part of the job, driving around in the car, if you will, takes the least amount of effort. It's all the other stuff that's got to go on behind it that doesn't get taken care of either because of poor leadership, poor political leadership, or a combination of the two and no funding. So you got to make your argument that way. You got to have somebody put that money into a budget so that it'll be acted upon. You'd be shocked. Cities shut down inspections units. Oh, I understand that.
Funding is the wrong answer.
But if it's not there, it's not there. I understand.
Other people, it is a civil right. So I don't care if you have the funding or not.
I understand.
For all the other civil rights.
If I could interject, I think the question was what can be done and how can you all, or we all, do a better job? And I think I would welcome dialogue after.
Advocacy.
Okay. And Lori, did you have an answer?
Yeah, I think you have raised an issue that we haven't been thinking about, and I think that what you do and what other people across the country do, who are advocates for the disabled, need to keep doing what they're doing, but we also need to open up our eyes and our ears to see that there are issues that we're not focused on. So I will be taking back your impassioned plea to my city to ask the right questions and make sure that we're doing what we need to do.
Other questions?
I just had a question about the background checks and education for the police officers. Do you know if in those major cities that was an effort to actually diversify the police force because of structures that were in place that kept people who look like the community from being in the police department? Do you know if that was like, it seems odd to me that a major city would be like, you know what, be dumber and be more criminal without some like legitimate reason for doing so.
No,
Maybe you're not the marketing guy.
What happens is these are self-inflicted wounds, right? To not pay attention to disabilities because of whatever reason, to say that we're not going to ask for more education because that will cost us more on the front end of hiring, because if you're coming out of a 4-year degree, and actually there is more diversity inside of the educational systems, right? Police departments should be taking advantage of the fact that Loyola University in New Orleans, John Jay in New York, they're diversifying their student body. So the police, my position when I was a chief was, well, we ought to be taking advantage of all the work they've been doing to diversify. But when you pull away that education requirement, I think it sends the message that you're not getting the very best you can get, and you can get the best in a very diverse way. So I disagreed with the concept that we need to reduce it because we've got to hire. We should have been hiring smart to begin with. The second thing about education is the Nashville Police Department, about 70% of the people in that department had at least an associate's degree and higher. In the New Orleans Police Department, less than 20% of the people had an associate's degree or higher. Which one of those two agencies was easier to supervise and to change? And they're both diverse, but I guess my round out point on this, I think it's a political cop-out to suggest that people drop the education requirement when in fact the education systems in America are more diverse than they've ever been, and that's where we can get the best possible future employees.
So, in San Francisco, I'd just say I think that was mostly a union push to reduce the requirements so that legacy hires and hires, right, we have a lot of legacy hires in the San Francisco Police Department, maybe others do too.
Could you explain what that is, legacy hire?
Right, so like my dad's a cop, my granddad's a cop, my aunt is a cop, and so even the people that do the background checking within the San Francisco Police Department often are reviewing the applications of family members or neighbors of family members. And it was one of the reforms that the Blue Ribbon panel suggested, was to have a more professionalized backgrounding system so that you can recruit and actually hire a more diverse, educated workforce. I think you actually, it's counterintuitive in some conversations we might have, but I think the education requirement probably helps you diversify in a city like San Francisco. But I think it's the unions that push those requirements down. The chief requirement getting pushed down was because there was a particular candidate that they wanted to get the job that did not have a college degree. And so they eliminated that requirement in the search criteria when all the prior chiefs had college degrees, including my boss, George, who had a law degree. So, you know, I think there's usually political forces pushing much of that.
I'm proud to tell you, I failed 3rd grade. You got to work to fail 3rd grade. I'm a high school dropout teenage parent. I got on the New Orleans Police Department with a GED. But that was 40 years ago. We should be able to strive for better if we're going to turn these young men and women out into the community and expect them to deliver this service in a way that's fair, just, and legitimate. Take advantage of the fact that other people have already trained them. Take advantage of the fact that they've already had education. Boils down to money, right? Boils down to money. You pay a New Orleans police officer today, 1 year out of the academy, $45,000, $46,000 a year. Work weekends, work holidays, work Mardi Gras, work the Jazz Fest. You come out of college, you get a job with IBM, you don't work weekends, you don't work out. We have to continue to recruit differently, and the more diverse, the better.
Yes, Archie Generoso from New Haven Police Department. I'm an assistant chief. And I agree with you, Chief, on education. But I also agree with you that we're not attracting those educated candidates because of the low pay, the long hours, the weekends, the nights. You know, we are also trying to do things innovatively to reflect our community. Our police departments need to look like the communities they police. It sounds corny to say that, but that's the way it should be. But in order to do that, we're going to have to be a little innovative. Right now, we have in New Haven, there's a high school public safety academy for high school students. And what we're trying to do now is to bridge that gap from high school to a community college and start public safety courses in a community college in not just police, but fire and EMT, okay, to ready these young men and women so when they reach the age of 21, they have that background and they have that education that they'll be valuable candidates for various emergency service like police, fire, and EMT. We need to do better than that. Just as we underpay our teachers, we underpay our police officers, especially in urban communities. We in New Haven are losing most of our good police officers. Well, not most, but a good number of our good police officers to surrounding towns that can afford to pay $20,000 a year more than no. And the cost of living in Connecticut is a lot higher than the cost of living in Louisiana, and our officers, after 4 years, don't make $46,000 a year. Now, after that time, they go up and they're in the 60s. But that's what we're competing against, when they can go to a bedroom town in Connecticut and make $80,000 a year their first year as a police officer. So we have to start thinking about that.
Okay.
And my question is to you is, where we need advocates from not only the police community, but the criminal justice community to speak up, and how do we get that?
We have to recognize that the method we've been using hasn't been working, right? We have 800,000 cops and 18,000 police departments, and many of them are getting the job done right every day, and many of them do great, brave things. But the ones that are making the mistakes are causing us a disproportionate amount of damage, and we have to figure out how to reconcile that.
So I'm just curious, sorry, Rosanna Ender from the University of Chicago. curious if you would consider policing a profession or a trade. And the reason that I'm asking is, I think the analogy of doing the sort of after action, really trying to look at it and figure out where the system failures are, makes a huge amount of sense. It's been really effective in medicine. It's another area where lives are at stake, quick decisions have to be made. But that is clearly a profession with clear standards of what they have to know how to do to be a doctor, but also the expectation, it's clear what you're asking the doctor to do for you. I think right now we've asked police to do what? What is the job of a police officer? Because in a city like Chicago, it is not the social workers that are showing up at 3 in the morning when a family needs probably a social worker who's showing up as a cop. And if we're going to expect them to do all the things that we're expecting them to do, we need to train them entirely differently. We need to think differently about what the job is, because I don't really think there's a consensus on what the job of a cop is. So I think we need to start with understanding what is the job. Is it a profession or a trade? If it's a profession, then we need to be training them and paying them very differently than we are if we expect to get a professional, really well-trained police force that can do all of the things besides carry a badge and a gun and meet the needs of communities. Or if we don't want police to do that and we actually want social workers to do that, then we need to start building up the capacity and making those investments. But we kind of want it both ways. We want to pay cops to do this other stuff, but then we get mad when we have adverse outcomes.
We're a trade. We don't have a universal standard of we don't have a universal standard of entry into the service. All the states have different standards. In some states, you have to have more hours of training to be a beautician than you do to be a police officer. So we're not a profession yet. And I would think we need to look back to every president of the United States, to include the most recent one, the current one, and the ones before him. It's been since Johnson that we've asked the core questions that Roseanne's asking. We have not come together as a nation since the 1960s and said, what is it we want the police to do? What do we want probation and parole to do? What do we want the courts to do? And every president, the IACP, which I'm very involved with, we've been asking since George Bush to do that. And we need that done desperately.
So if I could just add on to that, I actually might answer that question a little bit differently, because it's not clear to me that, to your point about how neighborhoods are different, certainly cities and states are going to have different answers to that question. I know a lot of police officers who want to be viewed as a profession. They view themselves as professionals. That badge has meaning to them. They think it's something they've worked hard and got specified training for, and they want to do that. But it doesn't change your point that there are services that we haven't trained them to provide. So in my mind, the question is, how do we have the community conversation so that our communities decide for themselves what they want out of their police department? Then we can have some legitimacy, because we know what we're supposed to provide and we do it, and then we learn from it how to do it better. So in my mind, it's the reason that I like the systems approach is that it starts by what is our desired outcome, and then when we have a deviation, we try to prevent it. And yes, we're always going to be playing whack-a-mole. Right? There's always going to be the next deviation and the next error and the next mistake, but the obligation is to learn from those and try to minimize those over time. So God knows I would never question you on answers having to do with policing, but what's more important to me is that the community be part of that system and it not be a closed loop.
Hi, we're Maria Ponomarenko with the Policing Project at NYU, and I actually just want to piggyback a little bit off John's latest comment and urge that we take a somewhat broader frame when we talk about accountability. So particularly in the early comments, it seemed like accountability was all about misconduct or even errors, if you will, without attributing blame, but it was individual incidents that had gone wrong in some way. And at the Policing Project, we tend to distinguish between back-end, that form of accountability, and front-end accountability, which is how government is typically accountable to the public pretty much everywhere else outside of policing. And so there's rules for what people can, for what police can and can't do. Those rules are transparent, and there's an opportunity for the public, and in particular the communities where police work, to actually have some voice in what policing looks like. So Lori, you talked a lot about legitimacy around policing in Chicago, and I think the legitimacy gap is around misconduct for sure, but lots of people's complaints are just about conduct. It's about things that police are doing that are entirely lawful, but people are unhappy with. And so as we kind of move forward and think about what accountability in policing looks like, I would urge folks to think about the front end as much as the back end.
Can I just follow up on that? Hello, Maria. I just made a note to myself that, as many of you know, we're going now through a consent decree process in Chicago. not with the Department of Justice, but through the Illinois Attorney General's office. And I think it provides us with a unique opportunity to have the very conversation that John just mentioned, which is, what do we want our policing structure to look like? Rosanna's point that she's made so well today and at other times, what's the job of a police officer? What do we want them to be doing? Instead of thinking about this tactically, we need to think about it strategically. And I think, frankly, in Chicago, we have a real unique opportunity to set a standard that hopefully be one that it will have a ripple effect across the country. But it truly does begin with understanding the relationship between the police and the community and what the community wants out of that partnership. And I think that's something that we're not spending enough time on. There's complaints, there's anger, there's frustration, but fundamentally at its core, we have to decide, what do we want our police department to look like? What do we want it to be? What do we want its relationship to be vis-a-vis the public? And hopefully in Chicago we'll take advantage of that opportunity.
We have time for 2 more questions. Chief.
Dean Esserman, Police Foundation, formerly police chief. With my dear friend Chief Generoso, we work together in New Haven. Even if I wasn't part of the Police Foundation today, I would say that the Police Foundation, I remember, did some interesting work understanding what police officers spend their time doing. Really akin to what Rosanna says in front of me, my friend, which is that if you really look at what police officers spend their time doing, whether we want them to or not, the community needs them to be doing more public safety work than just narrow crime work. In fact, to see the police as enforcers of the law alone is really to miss the point of what they spend the majority of their day doing. But because it's not embraced or recognized as considered fringe work, it's done in the shadows, right? I've delivered 8 children in the shadows. None of them my own. I haven't shot 8 people. But it's what they need the police to do those 8 nights. I think that what Rosanna says is terribly important, that we need to clearly define in today's era of deinstitutionalization, of less and less funding for support organizations and the social service agency, that the police have become the agency of first resort, not just last resort. Towards that, I agree with my friend in the front that it is not a profession, but it needs to be a profession. The benefits of having a decentralized democratic police force is that there's no American police force, there's no American police standards, there's no American police coherence. It's as if you went to the hospital and you were trained in the basement together and you lived that life in the hospital, and that's the level of medical service you got. That's the level of police service you get town to town. One chief can't speak for another, one police department can't speak for another. And one of the things I think we can take away from is the medical model, and I want to ask you if it makes sense to you, of a teaching police department, the concept that it's lifelong learning. When I was sick in the hospital for some time, I realized that there was a beginning roll call and there was an ending roll call. The professionals came together at the end of the day, and not just beginning to turn the ward over like a neighborhood, and every opportunity was learned for lifelong education. We don't invest much in our police officers, and this is my question for you, post their academy training. We put talk into recruiting, diversity or not. We put talk into academy curriculum. And then, unlike other professions, we don't require much of them for the rest of their life. And I'm wondering whether you think that the medical model is a good model of continuous lifetime education. It's a costly model.
I mean, look, you've clearly answered your own question, right? I mean, you know, I can't think of an industry that isn't a lifelong learning. I mean, Taco Bell rearranges those same 5 ingredients into a new thing every 6 months. So it's always lifetime learning, kind of whatever you're doing, and you've got to take that on. I think the question is more execution of lifelong learning, because the only constant is change, and things are always going to be moving, and you're always going to have to be learning things. The question is, and this to me is what legitimacy and accountability means. Again, it means, yeah, we're doing what we're doing. Can we do it better, and are we working to do that sincerely? If you're accountable, your answer to that question is yes. And I'm going to tell you why, and I'm going to show you how, and then I'm going to listen to the answer about whether I can do even that better. And that feedback loop between the criminal justice system and its community is what you have to do to be accountable. Training is one of those over the long term, not allowing people to get complacent in their roles, moving people around in organizations so that they get different ways to see a role, engaging people with community events so that our communities and our police departments look similar. All of these are symptoms of the larger problem of accountability and of, are we trying to get better, or are we happy where we are? If you're happy where you are, you're not probably going to ultimately be accountable for improving the system.
Hi, my name is Nazia Fiazi. I'm here from John Jay, and I also do research at Mount Sinai in an area of neuroscience and law, or neurocriminology. So I study like violence and the brain and violence. So you quoted some research that you guys did about officers and they're older. The ones that are older, could you just expound on that and other variables that you might have found? And also, the second thing I wanted to say is, aside from educational requirements, at a previous conference, I've mentioned that I believe whether it's correctional officers or police officers, I believe that they also should have more training in development of the mind, the brain, to understand how to handle, whether, especially juveniles and just adults, people with mental disabilities, on how to handle them. I guess because I study the brain a lot, that's on my mind. So I wanted to know what you think about that after you answer the first question, all of you.
Okay, yeah, so the easiest answer to the first question is I'll send you the paper. I mean, there are myriad factors that Greg looked at. The largest factor was the age at which you were when you joined the force. Other factors, clearly, you know, there are people who have more disciplinary write-ups than others, and they're more likely to pull their guns, and education level is part of it, and, you know, all sorts of other factors that Greg analyzed and corrected for, and it's probably too lengthy a list, and I don't, frankly, remember them all to do it right now. But the takeaway for me, the one that was sort of heads and shoulders above all the others, was one that is like, if you're 25 when you join the force instead of 17, you're much less likely to pull your gun. And that's kind of in keeping with what we know about violent crime, which is it's a young man's game, right? When you're in your 50s, you're much less likely to recidivate with a violent offense than you are if you're, you know, when you're 20. So it kind of makes intuitive sense to me, but it's not something that you would have thought of unless you'd done what, you know, Greg's innovation was, kind of making that comparison. But I'm happy to send you the paper and all of the other factors that he corrected for. No, just in the incident. If we were at the same incident and somebody gets shot, the question is, it's a situation where I pulled my gun and she didn't. And so we compare the characteristics of us, and Greg does that over, I think, 250 officers or something like that, and reaches those conclusions. The second part of your question, I'm sorry.
Juvenile brain development.
Oh. So I think there's all sorts of I mean, actually, I think the field of positive psychology is really fascinating right now in its application to policing and to criminal justice. And I think the issues with resilience, issues with reactions to stress, issues with mindfulness, issues with positive thinking, issues with cognitive behavioral therapy and de-escalation training, and I think all of those things to build up the psyches of officers. And I think actually in our national dialogue, when you're more comfortable with yourself and you feel like you're able to be heard, you're more able to engage in the kind of conversations we all want to have. So I think we should absolutely be giving our officers training to strengthen them. I think burnout and stress and, I mean, who's more afraid of a traffic stop right now, me or the cop who pulled me over, no matter where I live? That's a real problem, right? And that fear of approaching that car when a 46-year-old white dude, you know, is behind the wheel, because you have no idea, am I John HOLLWAY, mild-mannered law professor, or am I that whack job in Las Vegas, right? And the police officer doesn't know. So how do we bolster that so that he can approach that situation with some calmness and not jump to some emotional stress response, right? So I think absolutely that stuff is important, but it's as important to protect our policemen as it is to protect our communities. And sometimes I feel like we don't balance that part of the equation.
If I was a chief today, of all the myriad things that would be on my mind, two of the highest would be adopting Professor Rosenbaum's idea to do justice legitimacy of the sergeants and the lieutenants to the cops so that they know what that feels like on the outside. And the other would be to follow the work of Professor Kaufman and others at the University of California, Irvine, about brain development of juveniles to help officers see young people who are probably traumatic informed responses, and they will see them as the need of a guardian when before they might have seen it as a warrior. So that, of all the things I'd be working on, those would be the two highest priorities I'd be focused on right now.
And just the last point, and I'm going to pick up on a point that Rosanna made, particularly in large urban areas where we have disinvested or not invested sufficient resources to deal with the myriad of urban challenges. The police officers are confronting that every single day. So it's incumbent upon us, one, I think we got to make those investments, but we also need to make sure that we are training officers not to be the social worker, not to be the teacher, not to be the drug addiction counselor, but to be mindful of the fact that those are the circumstances that they are going to encounter every single time that they answer a call at a house, they answer a call at a hospital, they stop somebody in a car in the street. Because if they're not equipped to recognize, not be the expert, but to at least recognize what they're going to encounter, they are not going to be properly equipped to deal with the realities of policing, and we are doing them a terrible disservice, and we're doing the public a disservice.
Just quickly, I would add to that to think about prosecutors as part of the brain development conversation. So police have the difficulty of having to react in a split second. We have the luxury of having time, right? We get at least 2 days in California before we have to file a case, and then we have the length of a case to think about what the right thing to do is. We just started a young adult court a year ago. It's for 18 to 25-year-olds. They're almost all there on robberies, which is, as a Part 1 crime, a serious crime. But with this idea that the brain development of those, mostly men, but some women, is not caught up to what we as society expect of their behavior, and so we need to have an approach that there's an intervention, obviously, because it's a serious offense, but that we do it in a way that is mindful of the neuroscience and their cognitive development and helps them have healthy brain development, not putting them into cages and in really carceral situations that are going to delay that brain development even further. So trying to help build up their impulse control and cognitive therapy and a whole range of services as part of that are mindful of where they are developmentally. So I think that's an important part of the conversation. You can't always have on the street, right? That's not the moment necessarily to diagnose. Are you reacting to me this way because you're 18? Or are you reacting to me this way because you're reacting to me this way, right? And so I think it's a little unfair to put all of that in a patrolman's or woman's lap, but I think the courthouse, there's plenty of time for that deliberative process, and it should be happening there too.